Welcome to Part 3 of Navigating Therapeutic Behavioral Consultation. In this part of the training, we will go over regulations and guidelines for therapeutic behavioral consultation. This training is specific to behavioral consultation services and not other services provided under therapeutic consultation, such as speech therapy, OT, PT, psychology, or any other service. Please review Parts 1 and 2 of this training if you have questions or are unfamiliar with the content. The last segment of this training will focus on DBHDS and DMAS regulations, the DBHDS DMAS practice guidelines and BSPARI, as well as human rights. Providers should be well versed in the regulations for providing therapeutic behavioral consultation. Here are the links to learn more. Provider Manual Chapter 4, page 159, begins the discussion of therapeutic consultation. Here are the allowable activities for this service that can be found in the aforementioned regulations and Provider Manual. If this information is new to you, please take a moment to pause and review. Therapeutic behavioral consultative services can be provided via telehealth over the phone, as well as through synchronous video feed using a HIPAA-compliant video platform. Therapeutic behavioral consultation is the only therapeutic consultation service where direct therapy with an individual is a billable activity. However, direct therapy cannot be provided via telehealth, as the person needs to be physically present in the same environment. Please see the examples listed on this slide. Telehealth consultation related to our person-centered outcomes, which do not constitute direct therapy, is permitted. This may include, but is not limited to, functional behavior assessment, such as interviews and observations, assessing current interventions, training stakeholders, and consultation related to person-centered outcomes. Services delivered via telemedicine or audio-only telehealth must be provided with the same standard of care as services provided in person. Telemedicine or audio-only telehealth must not be used when in-person services are medically and/or clinically necessary. The distant provider is responsible for determining that the services meet all requirements and standards of care. When billing for services, log into the MES portal and go to the Provider Management PRSS portal. This is where you will go to do your billing. To acquire more information on billing, see the link for a video tutorial to get started in the PRSS portal, as well as the link to billing tutorials on the Medicaid website. Billing can occur daily, weekly, or monthly, but providers must bill within 365 days from the service date. When entering in a diagnostic code into the system, do not include decimal points. Use the primary diagnostic code that qualifies the individual for the waiver. Lastly, make sure that the service authorization number has not changed. If you are having issues that you cannot resolve, please contact Jason Perkins at jasonperkins@dmas.virginia.gov. Here are some links that you can access in the PDF version of the PowerPoint located on the Behavioral Services webpage. Please make sure to look at the current DD waiver rates on an annual basis, as rates may change. Appendix D is the dedicated section that walks you through the service authorization process for each service. And remember, the system will only accept whole numbers, so follow the rounding rule defined in this slide. The DBHDS Therapeutic Consultation Regulations outlines the documentation that is required for the service. See the link provided. Those service documentation requirements include those listed on the slide. Service providers must maintain documentation for review by DBHDS and DMAS for a period no less than 6 years from the individual's last day of service or as provided by state law, whichever period is longer. Providers need to retain client information with signatures and documentation just in case a provider is audited. The DBHDS-DMAS practice guidelines for behavior support plans were developed based off indicators listed in the DOJ settlement agreement that outlines expectations for this service. Here is the link to the practice guidelines that are posted on Town Hall. You can also find these guidelines on the DBHDS Behavioral Services website. Consider it a guidance document for this service. The practice guidelines break down and give additional information for the elements in each content area. We use the behavior support guidelines to evaluate the quality of behavior support plans. Additionally, it has a brief literature review on utilizing positive behavior supports, person-centered planning, and incorporating a trauma-informed approach as it relates to behavior support plans. The authorization table that was reviewed earlier in Part 2 of this training is also available in the practice guidelines. In consultation with provider organizations in Virginia and via public comment on Therapeutic Behavioral Consultation redesign, the above areas have been determined by DBHDS to be minimum BSP components which are required per regulation to be included in behavior support plans. Some behaviorists may utilize different terminology than what is noted above in their BSPs. DBHDS conducts ongoing quality reviews to determine adherence to these content areas and other regulatory requirements. Minimum components are outlined in regulatory language to ensure that the service provided to waiver recipients are consistently in line with what is generally accepted as best practice for this type of service. The minimum required BST content areas consist of demographic information, person-centered information, history and rationale for services, functional behavior assessment, hypothesized functions of behavior, behaviors targeted for decrease, behaviors targeted for increase, antecedent strategies, consequence strategies, safety or crisis guidelines if they apply, a plan for training, appropriate signatures, and graphical displays and analysis. Behaviorists who are completing functional behavior assessments and subsequently developing behavior support plans may wish to include other areas beyond what is noted above. However, what is included above constitutes what is expected as content areas for behavior support plans for any BSP that is developed for waiver recipients. Here's an example of a content area with minimum elements outlined in the guidelines for functional behavior assessment that should be present in behavior support plans. Each element is defined with examples, along with the notes section to help providers incorporate the minimum elements to satisfy quality assurance efforts. DBHDS developed the Behavior Support Plan Adherence Review Instrument, or BSPARI for short, to evaluate the required elements and behavior support plans to meet expectations of the settlement agreement. This quality assurance tool is used to evaluate the overall adherence of assessment and behavioral programming to the aforementioned practice guidelines and regulations. There are 69 elements across 13 content areas. Elements and content areas are weighted and condensed into a 40-point system. To be in adherence, plans must achieve a score of 85% or 34 out of 40 points. The BSPARI is available for view on the DBHDS Behavioral Services webpage. It includes links to resources for each content area, as well as definitions for elements based off the practice guidelines. Statistical examples of plans are evaluated across therapeutic consultation providers to evaluate the quality of plans written for consumers. Feedback sessions are provided for each provider to discuss items that were in adherence and those that were missing. The BSPARI is housed with a Microsoft Excel workbook containing many automated features. For instance, drop-down selections that cannot be altered. For most elements, a check mark is used to indicate the presence of the element, and an X represents inadequacy or the absence of an element. The tool uses a green versus red color coding scheme for each content area, and for the total score. This lets reviewers and clinicians easily see any areas that need improvement, colored in red, and those that received all possible points, colored in green. The BSPARI tool has two additional tabs at the bottom of the spreadsheet, one that houses resources, along with the BSPARI definition tab that describes the elements that are located in the practice guidelines. To provide additional support, the elements that are missing highlight resources in red. For ease of access, there are direct hyperlinks to over 100 journal articles, abstracts, and other helpful resources that may improve plan quality. Providers can access the BSPARI Definitions tab to review the definitions for elements that are outlined in the DMAS DBHDS guidelines. There is a feedback process with providers who have submitted plans that are lower than 34 points on the BSPARI review. The purpose is to provide behaviorists with constructive feedback to aim at improving future iterations of a plan as well as plans in general. A virtual meeting is set up with the provider that usually lasts about 30 minutes. An encrypted email is sent out once a meeting time has been agreed upon that contains encrypted copies of the BSPARI tool in advance to allow the behaviorist to review the content prior to the meeting. Content of the meeting includes highlighting areas that are in adherence and trend areas that are not in adherence. The reviewer can also provide technical assistance when needed, direct providers to educational resources, and help troubleshoot barriers to providing the service. The meeting is not intended to provide treatment advice. By providing these feedback sessions, subsequent programming should see improvement in areas that were not in adherence and maintain areas of adherence. Once feedback has been reviewed, DBHDS will request that the plan author revise and resubmit to the reviewer via encrypted email or notify the reviewer when the document has been uploaded in WAMS. Timeline for resubmission will be approximately 30 days, but the reviewer will work with the provider to come up with an expectation that is feasible. The reviewer will rescore the plan and provide additional feedback for revised adherence and maintain adherence back to the plan author. Another feedback session with the provider may be requested if the resubmitted plan was not scored in adherence. The goal is that the subsequent programming would see improvements in adherence, along with generalization across plans penned by a behaviorist. It is important to also be aware of the human rights regulations when developing and implementing behavior support plans, especially if they include any restrictions to the dignity and freedoms of everyday life. Freedoms of everyday life include, but are not limited to, the freedom to move within the service setting, its grounds, and community, to communicate, associate, and meet privately with anyone, to have and spend money, to see, hear, or receive TV, radio, books, and newspapers, to keep and use personal clothing and personal items, to use recreational facilities and enjoy the outdoors, and to make purchases in canteens, vending machines, and stores selling a basic selection of food and clothing. Conversations about implementing restrictions should be person-centered and take place with the individual, authorized representative, support coordinator, advocate, and other members of the treatment team. Restrictions must be approved by the local Human Rights Committee, or the LHRC, when restrictions last longer than 7 days, and/or the restriction is imposed 3 or more times during a 30-day period. A plan incorporating a timeout procedure or restraint must be reviewed by the LHRC and IRC prior to implementation. Here is a link to a training covering this material. The Restrictions to Dignity and Freedoms of Everyday Life request for LHRC review form must be completed. The LHRC will provide recommendations for appropriate implementation of restrictions according to the regulations. There is a separate office at DBHDS that can assist with human rights regulations. Take some time to look over the information that is in Chapter 115, Regulations to Assure Rights of Individuals Receiving Services from Providers Licensed, Funded, or Operated by DBHDS. In these chapters, you will find information on restrictions on freedoms of everyday life, rules and regulations about behavioral treatment plans, and rules and regulations about the use of seclusion, restraint, and timeout. If you have any questions regarding human rights and restrictions, please contact your human rights advocate for advice. This concludes Part 3 of Navigating Therapeutic Behavioral Consultation. PowerPoint slides with links, along with a task analysis to help with your journey into providing therapeutic behavioral consultation, can be accessed under the Training Videos tab on the Behavioral Service Page website.